On the morning of April 21, 1918, at precisely 0530 hours, Gefreiter Heinrich König positioned himself in a hastily dug rifle pit approximately 400 meters from the British lines near Villers-Bretonneux. The muddy French dawn would soon give way to an engagement that would fundamentally alter infantry anti-armor doctrine for the remainder of the Great War. At 19 years of age, König had already served 14 months on the Western Front and witnessed the introduction of the British Mark IV tank during the previous autumn's operations. The German High Command had strategically distributed approximately 15,000 of the newly developed Tank-Gewehr rifles along the Western Front by April 1918, preparing for the anticipated British armored counteroffensive. As König settled into his position with the 13-kilogram weapon resting on a makeshift sandbag support, he prepared himself for what military theorists were calling the future of warfare. The rifle he carried measured 168 centimeters in total length and fired a cartridge originally designed to penetrate armored vehicles at ranges exceeding 500 meters. The engineering specifications presented severe challenges to any soldier assigned to operate the weapon. The 13.2 by 92 mm cartridge generated approximately 15,000 joules of muzzle energy, representing nearly 10 times the recoil force of a standard Gewehr 98 service rifle. The single-shot bolt-action mechanism required the operator to manually cycle the action after each discharge, exposing himself to enemy fire while reloading. German ordnance engineers had characterized the Tank-Gewehr as a temporary solution to an urgent tactical problem, a characterization that proved accurate in numerous uncomfortable ways. The physical toll of operating the weapon became apparent during training exercises. Even with proper technique and adequate padding, firing the Tank-Gewehr resulted in severe bruising to the shoulder and collarbone of the operator. Medical officers attached to infantry divisions reported a significant increase in shoulder injuries among designated anti-tank riflemen during March 1918. The recoil forces occasionally resulted in broken collarbones among soldiers who failed to position the weapon correctly against their shoulder before firing. König had experienced the weapon's punishing characteristics during his initial familiarization training 2 weeks earlier. The training officer had emphasized the critical importance of proper body positioning, firm contact between buttstock and shoulder, and immediate follow-through after firing to prevent the rifle from striking the operator's face during recoil. The demonstration had included graphic photographs of training casualties who had failed to respect these procedures. One soldier had lost 3 teeth when the Tank-Gewehr's stock recoiled into his jaw. Another had sustained a fractured cheekbone. The tactical doctrine governing the Tank-Gewehr reflected the weapon's severe limitations. German infantry manuals instructed anti-tank riflemen to engage armored targets only at ranges under 300 meters, aiming specifically at vision ports, track assemblies, or other vulnerable points where the armor was thinnest or absent entirely. The 13.2 mm solid steel projectile possessed sufficient kinetic energy to penetrate 13 mm of rolled homogeneous armor at 100 meters, though this capability decreased rapidly with increasing range. Most importantly, the doctrine emphasized patience and fire discipline. The single-shot mechanism meant a trained operator could achieve a maximum rate of fire of approximately 6 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. In combat, with trembling hands and enemy fire incoming, 3 rounds per minute represented a more realistic expectation. Every shot had to count toward mission success. Wasting ammunition on low-probability targets was explicitly forbidden in the training materials. Koenig had witnessed the consequences of inadequate preparation during his first encounter with British armor 3 days earlier. A tank Gewehr team positioned 50 meters to his left had engaged a Mark IV female tank at 400 meters range, far beyond the weapon's effective penetration capability. The 13.2 millimeter rounds had struck the tank's armor plating and ricocheted harmlessly into the air. The tank's machine guns had immediately identified the shooter's position through the distinctive muzzle flash and smoke signature. Both German soldiers died before they could reload for a second shot. The official doctrine demanded patience and precise shot placement from anti-tank riflemen. Koenig had begun questioning whether doctrine adequately addressed the reality that tanks rarely presented ideal engagement opportunities. British armor tactics emphasized rapid movement and suppressive fire to prevent infantry from establishing stable firing positions. Waiting for a tank to close to 100 meters meant accepting concentrated machine gun fire from the vehicle's sponson-mounted weapons during the approach. The British offensive scheduled for April 21st involved 16 Mark IV tanks advancing in support of 3 infantry battalions. Australian and British troops would attempt to recapture Villers-Bretonneux, which had fallen to German forces during the spring offensive 3 weeks earlier. Intelligence reports indicated the attack would commence at dawn, with the tanks leading the advance to suppress German defensive positions before the infantry assault. Koenig methodically checked his ammunition supply, confirming 20 rounds of 13.2 by 92 millimeter cartridges in the leather pouch beside his position. The training manual indicated this quantity would prove sufficient for engaging multiple armored targets during a single engagement. However, Koenig had already concluded the manual was fundamentally wrong about virtually everything else regarding anti-tank rifle tactics. By noon of that day, he would determine whether his alternative approach was correct. The cost of being wrong would be a German military cemetery and a letter delivered to his family in Bavaria. The assembled German defensive line stretched across 2 kilometers of cratered farmland at the approaches to Villers-Bretonneux. Koenig observed the morning fog beginning to lift as pale light spread across no man's land. Ahead lay the British jumping-off trenches, then the communication trenches, and finally the concentration areas where tanks would be positioning themselves for the assault. Friendly artillery had been registered on these approach routes during the previous evening, though limited fire support would be available during the coming engagement. Koenig had spent his initial weeks with the tank Gewehr following established doctrine precisely. The training prescribed waiting for the tank to close to effective range, aiming carefully at vulnerable points, firing single well-placed shots, and conserving ammunition for the duration of the engagement. The training instructors at the divisional school had drilled these procedures into every student with repetitive emphasis. Ammunition quantities were limited, and precision mattered more than volume of fire. A disciplined anti-tank rifleman could theoretically make 20 rounds last an entire day of defensive operations. This doctrine operated on the assumption that tank crews would cooperate with German defensive timelines. The British demonstrated no such cooperation. Tank commanders had studied German anti-tank tactics extensively and understood the timing of defensive fire. Knowing that riflemen waited until close range before engaging, they advanced rapidly while suppressing suspected defensive positions with machine gun fire, denying German infantry the stable firing platforms necessary for accurate shooting. By the time anti-tank riflemen finally achieved proper sight pictures, significant casualties had already been inflicted on the defensive positions. Koenig had calculated the tactical problem from a different perspective. A Mark IV tank at 400 meters did not represent an impossibly difficult target. The vehicle was moving at walking speed across open ground, presenting a profile measuring 8 meters in length and over 2 meters in height. The closure rate meant the apparent size of the target increased steadily as range decreased toward optimal firing distance. A rifleman who initiated fire early could observe his point of impact, make necessary adjustments to his aim, and potentially achieve disabling hits before the tank reached effective machine gun range. The risk inherent in this approach involved ammunition conservation. 20 rounds sounded like a substantial quantity until divided by the number of tanks likely to be encountered during a major offensive operation. Intelligence predicted 16 armored vehicles in the assault. At 2 rounds expended per tank, the mathematics became brutally unfavorable. A rifleman who fired at extended range might exhaust his ammunition before the battle concluded, leaving his sector defenseless against subsequent waves. Koenig consciously accepted this trade-off as preferable to the alternative. A rifleman who conserved ammunition meticulously but died during the initial tank assault had made an extremely poor bargain. Survival required disrupting the enemy's advance before armored vehicles could establish firing positions that dominated the defensive line. If this aggressive approach meant potentially running low on ammunition later in the engagement, he would address that problem when it arose. Dead men had absolutely no use for reserve ammunition carefully conserved according to doctrine. His first opportunity to test this alternative tactical approach had come during a minor skirmish on April 18th, when a single British Whippet tank had probed German positions east of Hamel. The fast-moving vehicle approached at approximately 12 kilometers per hour, considerably faster than the standard Mark IV. Standard doctrine explicitly stated to wait until the tank closed to 150 meters before engaging. Koenig had fired at 300 meters instead, aiming at the vehicle's track assembly. The initial round missed entirely, striking the ground 5 meters ahead of the target. He cycled the bolt action, chambered a second round, adjusted his aim upward to compensate for the miss, and fired again. The second 13.2 millimeter projectile struck the Whippet's left track, severing one of the track links. The vehicle slewed to the left and ground to a halt with its damaged track assembly dragging uselessly beside the hull. The crew abandoned the immobilized tank 3 minutes later when German artillery began ranging on the stationary target. Following the engagement, Koenig's section commander questioned him about his ammunition expenditure and range estimation. 2 rounds expended against a single tank at extended range violated established procedures. At that rate of consumption, he would exhaust his ammunition supply before half the expected number of tanks had been engaged. The training materials existed for carefully considered reasons, and Koenig seemed to be disregarding them entirely. However, the immobilized Whippet remained visible in no man's land for 3 days afterward, providing tangible evidence that long-range engagement could produce results. Other tank Gewehr operators in the sector began discussing the incident. Some characterized the approach as fortunate marksmanship rather than viable tactics. Hitting a moving target at 300 meters with a single-shot rifle required either exceptional skill or extraordinary luck. The training manuals existed for carefully considered reasons, and individual success stories did not invalidate systematic doctrine. The first British tanks appeared at 0618 hours, emerging from the morning fog in groups of 4 vehicles. Koenig counted 8, then 12, then discontinued counting as the formations became overwhelming. The muddy ground ahead filled with armored vehicles bearing the distinctive rhomboid shape of the Mark IV. The lead tank commenced its advance toward the German positions at approximately 5 kilometers per hour, crawling forward with its sponson-mounted machine guns already firing. Koenig tracked the nearest tank through his iron sights, watching it grow progressively larger with each passing second. At 450 meters, he settled the rifle firmly against his shoulder, confirmed his body position was correct to absorb the recoil, and squeezed the trigger. The tank-Gewehr roared, sending a 13.2 millimeter projectile downrange at over 800 meters per second. The recoil slammed into his shoulder with tremendous force, driving him backward against the rear wall of his rifle pit. The first round fell short, striking the ground approximately 10 meters ahead of the approaching tank. Koenig cycled the bolt action, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. He adjusted his aim upward, accounting for the observed point of impact, and fired again. This round struck the tank's hull near the forward section, producing a bright spark visible even in daylight. The armor had held against the impact, but the tank commander now knew a tank-Gewehr was engaging his vehicle. At 350 meters, Koenig fired his third round. This projectile struck the tank's starboard sponson, penetrating the thinner armor protecting the machine gun position. The tank continued advancing, but its right machine gun had ceased firing. One weapon system disabled, 7 rounds expended, 13 rounds remaining, 14 tanks still advancing across no man's land. The mathematics were becoming unfavorable rapidly. Koenig had no time available to perform detailed calculations. The second tank in the British formation was approaching from a slightly different angle, presenting a quartering shot rather than a direct frontal aspect. He shifted his aim to this new target, settling the sights on the vehicle's track assembly where it connected to the drive sprocket. At 320 meters, he fired. The 13.2 millimeter round struck precisely where intended, shattering one of the track pins and causing 3 track links to separate. The tank lurched violently to the right as the damaged track assembly lost tension. The vehicle continued moving in a slow circle, unable to maintain its intended course with one track damaged. The crew attempted to compensate by adjusting throttle settings, but the mechanical damage prevented effective control. Koenig had achieved 1 mobility kill, 8 rounds expended, 12 rounds remaining, 14 tanks still advancing. The British had adapted their tactics in response to the anti-tank fire. Instead of maintaining formation, the tanks had spread out laterally, increasing the frontage of their advance and forcing German defensive fire to divide attention across multiple targets. The modification demonstrated that British tank commanders understood they were facing concentrated anti-tank weapons and were implementing immediate countermeasures. A Mark IV advanced directly toward Koenig's position, its commander apparently having identified the rifle pit as the source of the anti-tank fire that had disabled 2 vehicles. The tank's machine guns concentrated on his position, sending 7.7 millimeter rounds cracking overhead and impacting the sandbag protection surrounding his fighting position. Koenig pressed himself against the bottom of the rifle pit as bullets shredded the sandbags, sending dirt cascading down onto his helmet and shoulders. He could not return fire while machine gun rounds dominated his position. The tank-Gewehr required stable positioning to achieve accurate shots, and raising his head above the parapet invited immediate death from concentrated small arms fire. The tank continued advancing, closing the range to 200 meters, then 150 meters, then 100 meters. The machine gun fire intensified as the range decreased and the British gunners refined their aim. At 75 meters, the tank's engine noise became overwhelming. The distinctive sound of the Daimler 6-cylinder power plant running at maximum load filled the air, drowning out other battlefield sounds. Koenig risked the quick glance over the parapet. The Mark IV was less than 50 meters away, close enough that he could observe individual rivets in the armor plating and read tactical markings painted on the hull. The tank drove directly over his rifle pit, passing overhead with its massive tracks churning the muddy ground on either side of his position. The vehicle's belly armor was visible just centimeters above his head as it crossed his fighting position. Koenig remained motionless in the bottom of the pit, waiting for the tank to pass. The machine guns could not depress sufficiently to fire into the rifle pit while the vehicle was positioned directly above. The tank continued forward, moving past his position toward the German reserve trenches 200 meters to the rear. Koenig emerged from his rifle pit and turned to engage the vehicle from behind. The rear aspect presented a theoretically easier target, as the Mark IV's rear armor was thinner than its frontal protection and lacked the angular deflection geometry that characterized the vehicle's bow plating. At 40 meters range, Koenig fired into the tank's engine compartment. The 13.2mm projectile penetrated the rear armor plate, striking something vital inside the engine bay. White smoke began pouring from the vehicle's exhaust manifolds. The tank continued moving for another 20 meters before grinding to a halt with its engine seized from catastrophic mechanical failure. The crew began evacuating through the roof hatches. Koenig cycled his bolt action and aimed at the tank commander, then deliberately elevated his rifle and fired over the man's head. Killing tank crews abandoning disabled vehicles violated his personal code of conduct, regardless of what military regulations might permit. The British soldiers scattered toward their own lines, running through the muddy terrain while German infantry fire crackled around them. 9 rounds expended. 11 rounds remaining. 13 tanks still operational in the British assault. The mathematics had become untenable. Koenig could not possibly disable 13 tanks with 11 rounds of ammunition, regardless of his marksmanship skill or tactical approach. The realization forced a fundamental reassessment of his situation. The Tank-Gewehr's design philosophy assumed that infantry would face tanks in limited numbers, perhaps 2 or 3 vehicles supporting a battalion-level attack. The weapon system was never intended to counter massed armor formations involving dozens of vehicles. German ordnance engineers had not anticipated that the British would concentrate 16 tanks in a single assault sector. The tactical problem exceeded the technical solution that the Tank-Gewehr represented. Koenig made an immediate decision based on the tactical reality confronting him. Rather than attempting to disable additional tanks with his remaining ammunition, he would focus on disruption. Firing at tanks even without achieving penetrating hits forced their commanders to button up, closing their vision ports and restricting their situational awareness. Buttoned-up tanks were less effective at engaging infantry targets and more vulnerable to close assault teams carrying stick grenades and explosive charges. At 210 meters, he engaged the nearest tank with 3 rapid shots, cycling the bolt action as quickly as his training permitted. 2 rounds struck the vehicle's hull without penetration. The 3rd round shattered one of the vision blocks, blinding the driver. The tank slewed to the left, lost directional control, and collided with another Mark IV advancing alongside. Both vehicles became entangled as their track assemblies made contact, preventing either tank from continuing its advance. 6 rounds remaining. 2 tanks temporarily disabled through mechanical interference rather than weapons fire. 11 tanks still advancing. The British infantry had begun their assault, emerging from their trenches and advancing behind the armored vehicles. Australian troops moved forward in loose formations, using the tanks as mobile cover against German machine gun positions. Koenig's position had become untenable. British infantry were within grenade-throwing range, and remaining in the rifle pit guaranteed death or capture within minutes. He gathered his remaining ammunition, abandoned the Tankgewehr in the rifle pit, and withdrew toward the German reserve positions under covering fire from friendly machine guns. The battle continued for another 6 hours. British and Australian forces captured Villers-Bretonneux by early afternoon, though German counterattacks would reclaim portions of the town 3 days later. Of the 16 tanks that participated in the initial assault, 11 were knocked out by various causes, including Tankgewehr fire, artillery hits, mechanical failures, and close assault attacks by infantry grenade teams. Koenig's position had become untenable. British infantry were within grenade-throwing range, and remaining in the rifle pit guaranteed death or capture within minutes. He gathered his remaining ammunition, abandoned the Tankgewehr in the rifle pit, and withdrew toward the German reserve positions under covering fire from friendly machine guns. The battle continued for another 6 hours. British and Australian forces captured Villers-Bretonneux by early afternoon, though German counterattacks would reclaim portions of the town 3 days later. Of the 16 tanks that participated in the initial assault, 11 were knocked out by various causes, including Tankgewehr fire, artillery hits, mechanical failures, and close assault attacks by infantry grenade teams. Koenig survived the engagement without injury. The abandoned Tankgewehr was recovered the following day during a local counterattack that briefly retook his original defensive sector. The rifle's barrel had cracked from thermal stress after firing 12 rounds in rapid succession, rendering the weapon unserviceable without depot-level repair. The armorer who inspected the damaged rifle noted that the barrel's metallurgy had not been designed to withstand such intensive use. The after-action reports filed by German infantry units engaged at Villers-Bretonneux documented mixed results from Tankgewehr employment. Several tanks had been disabled by 13.2 mm fire, validating the weapon's basic effectiveness against armored targets. However, ammunition consumption rates had exceeded doctrinal projections by approximately 200% across all anti-tank rifle teams. The discrepancy between theoretical and actual usage patterns indicated that established doctrine required revision to reflect combat realities. British tank crews provided their own perspective during post-battle debriefings. Multiple commanders reported being engaged by large-caliber anti-tank rifles at ranges they considered beyond effective penetration distance. The early fire had not disabled their vehicles immediately, but had forced tactical adjustments that degraded their effectiveness against German defensive positions. Several commanders specifically mentioned closing vision ports and buttoning up their vehicles after receiving fire, trading situational awareness for protection against the heavy rifle rounds. The Tankgewehr had achieved its tactical purpose through mechanisms not entirely anticipated by its designers. The weapon's value extended beyond its ability to penetrate armor at close range. The psychological effect on tank crews, the disruption of armored formations, and the degradation of vehicle effectiveness through damage to external components all contributed to defensive success even when outright vehicle kills were not achieved. German ordnance authorities reviewed the Villers-Bretonneux engagement data during late April 1918. The findings indicated that anti-tank rifle doctrine required modification to account for the weapon's broader tactical utility beyond pure armor penetration. Revised guidelines issued in May authorized anti-tank riflemen to engage targets at extended ranges when tactical conditions suggested that disruption and suppression might prove more valuable than ammunition conservation. The bureaucratic language remained characteristically cautious, but the meaning was unmistakably clear. The approach that Koenig had employed instinctively during combat was becoming officially sanctioned throughout the German army. The experience of individual soldiers under fire was reshaping institutional doctrine to better reflect battlefield realities. Koenig never witnessed these policy changes take full effect across the Western Front. The German spring offensive had culminated by late May 1918, and Allied counteroffensives were beginning to reverse German territorial gains achieved earlier in the year. His unit was transferred to a quiet sector in Alsace during June, where tank encounters were infrequent and anti-tank rifles saw limited employment. The armistice of November 11, 1918, ended his combat service after 23 months on the Western Front. He returned to Bavaria in December, carrying no decorations beyond the standard Iron Cross Second Class awarded to most combat soldiers. His contribution to anti-tank rifle doctrine development remained unrecognized by official channels, as his tactical innovations had emerged from field expedients rather than formal experimentation programs. The Tank-Gewehr itself had a brief and limited service life. Approximately 15,800 rifles were manufactured between January and October 1918. The Treaty of Versailles explicitly prohibited German possession of anti-tank weapons, and the majority of surviving Tank-Gewehr rifles were destroyed during the post-war disarmament process. A small number were retained by Allied nations for study purposes, or found their way into the hands of various military forces during the interwar period. The weapon's technical characteristics influenced subsequent anti-tank rifle development across multiple nations during the 1930s. The British Boys rifle, Soviet PTRD and PTRS rifles, Polish WZ-35, and numerous other designs traced their conceptual lineage directly to the Mauser T-Gewehr. Each iteration attempted to address the fundamental problems that Koenig had encountered: excessive recoil, slow rate of fire, and inadequate penetration against increasingly thick armor protection. None of these successor designs solved the fundamental equation. Anti-tank rifles represented a temporary technical solution to the problem of armored vehicles. As tank armor thickness increased from 13 mm to 25 mm to 50 mm and beyond, the rifles became progressively obsolete. By 1942, anti-tank rifles were ineffective against the frontal armor of virtually all operational tank designs, relegated to engaging light vehicles and fortified positions. The tactical lessons proved more enduring than the weapons themselves. Koenig's recognition that disruption and suppression could achieve tactical effects even without armor penetration anticipated combined arms anti-tank doctrine that would develop fully during World War II. The integration of multiple weapon systems engaging armored vehicles simultaneously from different angles became standard practice across all modern militaries. Heinrich Koenig died in Munich on February 3, 1971, at the age of 72. He had worked as a postal clerk for 40 years following his return from the war, rarely discussing his military service with colleagues or family members. The Tank-Gewehr he had operated at Villers-Bretonneux had long since been destroyed in compliance with treaty obligations. No photographs documented his service with anti-tank rifle units, and his personnel records contained no mention of tactical innovations or doctrinal contributions.